Hi. So first of all, I'd be remiss in my duties as range program lead if I didn't remind everyone that the Society for Range Management is having its annual conference here at the Nugget starting this Sunday and going through all of next week. So hopefully many of you will be attending that. If you're here locally and you're not attending that, we are having a concert Wednesday night, Bryn Hill, which is open to everyone. So I have some flyers here, and if you're interested in coming to the concert, even if you're not coming to SRM, you're welcome. Okay, and so I spoke to the Sierra Front RAC, I don't know, several months ago at their last meeting, and so I've already bored them with this slideshow, so the rest of you can expect exciting things in the next few minutes. So the land health standards and guidelines are an important topic for us all because we base management off of that. And remember, I'm the range program lead, so what I'll be saying is, based from the range perspective largely, and I'll try to bring the other programs in as I can. I have that effect on technology. Okay, so I brought business cards if anyone needs one. There's my contact information should you have any follow-up questions. So go ahead, Chris. So we'll talk about the historical context and development. Why do we have standards and guidelines? And then how are they used in public lands management? And then of the 3 resource advisory councils in Nevada, we have 3 different sets of standards and guidelines. We'll briefly discuss that, and then how to address these standards, and why would a revision be needed, and if so, how would that be implemented or initiated? Go ahead. Okay, I'm really good at putting a lot of words on slides. So basically in '94 we had rangeland reform, and through that process, then in the '95 regulations, the 4180 subpart was added, of which is the standards and guidelines for rangeland health. And so they were developed to reflect the best available science for specific ecosystems or ecoregions, and that's why we have 3 sets of standards and guidelines throughout Nevada, because of the 3 different ecoregions represented. And then one of the big drivers behind getting standards and guidelines in place was to provide for greater consistency in how rangeland management was conducted, and the decisions on whether the rangeland was in good shape or not, and what direction to take things from there. And so the fundamentals for rangeland health and subsequently the standards and guidelines for rangeland health gave that consistent approach through the districts and the field offices on, what land health meant. And so they were to reflect proper functioning conditions, and they must be conditions that if met, would ensure sustainability and healthy, productive ecosystems. So that's sort of the drivers behind that. So in '95, again, we got the fundamentals of land health as subpart 4180 of the grazing regulations. And then the development of the resource advisory councils was in '95 in order to then do the standards and guidelines area specific for, for different geographic areas. And so in '97, we got 3 sets of Resource Advisory Council approved standards and guidelines throughout Nevada. So we have the Southern Mojave, we have the Sierra Front, and we have the Northeast Great Basin. So Doug has all 3. In '99, there was several Nevada Resource Advisory Councils that added a wild horse and burro standard and guideline. And then I say sort of, and we'll get into that. And in 2001, we got the 4180 handbook, and I brought a copy of the 4180 handbook for all of you. And then in 2006, we had some more Resource Advisory Council standard and guideline modifications throughout Nevada. And again, I'll say sort of. And then in 2009, we got the 4180 manual, which I also brought a copy of for all of you. And I also brought a copy of the 1997 standards and guidelines for all 3 Resource Advisory Council areas. The reason that 99 and 2006 say sort of is because all of the revisions that were made post-1997 are not official because they were never approved by the Secretary of Interior, which is the required last step to finalize standards and guidelines. And so the fundamentals of rangeland health include 4 components, and these are, very brief compared to how they read in the regulations, but I think it gets to the heart of it. We're looking for watersheds that are functioning properly. We're looking for ecological processes, hydrologic cycle, nutrient cycle, energy flow that support healthy biotic populations and communities. And we're looking for water quality that meets the state standards and meets BLM biological management objectives, such as clean water for fish. And we're looking for wildlife habitat that is being restored or maintained for special status species, such as T&E species, etc. And so by definition, a guideline is a practice, method, or technique determined to be appropriate to ensure that standards can be met or that significant progress can be made towards meeting the standard. And so a guideline is a tool such as a grazing system, a vegetative treatment, or an improvement project that helps managers and permittees achieve standards. Guidelines may be adapted or modified when monitoring or other information indicates the guideline is not effective or a better means of achieving the applicable standard becomes appropriate. And then the standard is the standard of land health are expressions of levels of physical and biological condition or degree of function required for healthy lands and sustainable uses and define minimum resource condition that must be achieved and maintained. And so by definition, it's expected that if the guidelines are followed, then you would be achieving or moving towards achievement of the standards. And so the guidelines, again, we have 3 sets of RAC standards and guidelines throughout Nevada, and so the guidelines for the Northeast Great Basin are not necessarily the same as the guidelines for Southern Mojave or for Sierra Front, and also with the standards. But they all have to meet at a bare minimum the needs of the fundamentals of rangeland health. And so in development of these standards and guidelines between 95 and 97, the geographic area, so again in 95, the Resource Advisory Councils were born, basically for the job of creating these standards and guidelines. And so until standards and guidelines for specific areas were created, then the fundamentals for land health were the fallback standards. And so all the standards and guidelines, not just in Nevada, but nationally, had to at least meet the fundamentals, and then they could have whatever supplementary needs might be required in a certain biological community or whatever for health of that particular area. And so in the development of the standards and guidelines, the geographic areas were defined, and that's through the consultation with the RACs, but the state director was the final designator of those areas. And so again, in Nevada, we have the 3 separate areas. And then the standards and guidelines are to be developed and amended by the BLM state directors in consultation with the RACs, state agencies, other federal agencies, and tribes, and the public. And then that's the kicker. They have to be approved by the Secretary of the Interior prior to being final. And of course, all the standards and guidelines must provide for conformance with the fundamentals. So they have to meet the needs of the fundamentals as the bare minimum, and then they can go above and beyond as that particular group and area needed any supplementation. So next, Kyle. Thank you. Okay, so this is out of the manual, and so what I had sort of been asked to do was to give a background on the standards and guidelines, and then sort of where we are with them right now and what types of things may or may not be used in your guys' thought process in terms, or well, you can use whatever you want, but things that you know, may lead the group to think that a revision might be needed, or things that might lead the group to believe that a revision is not needed. I'm starting to feel a little unsafe.
Wow.
Okay, that's my nervous laugh. Okay, good deal. So in the 2009 manual, it draws your attention to, so the BLM and the RACs have agreed to work together to evaluate and, where appropriate, expand these standards to ensure that there are land health standards that are relevant to all ecosystems and programs across public land, including livestock grazing. And so that word programs there, I'm sure many of you that have dealt with the standards and guidelines know that the 1997 standards and guidelines for all 3 Resource Advisory Council areas in Nevada are really for livestock grazing. And so, like I said, you know, some of the ones that were initiated since then but never finalized had to do with wild horse and burro, with recreation and OHV use. And so just in terms of whether the full extent of programs are addressed in a way that everyone is, you know, comfortable, meets the needs, that may be one thing that would enter the conversation as you guys decide whether revision would be needed or not. Go ahead, Kyle. And so this slide I just have to show from a 2009 IM the basic process of the permit renewal. And sorry, I don't have a poker face. It's all very amusing. So, you know, we prioritize the areas and gather information for the assessment. We go through the assessment and evaluation and decide whether standards are being met or not. And so if standards are achieved, then we go to the left there, and no action necessary. We don't need even a standard determination in that regard. And as this fits with the livestock program, we're not required legally to change livestock management if standards are met. So if standards are not achieved, then we go through a variety of a sequence of events, find out, you know, what the trend is it getting better, is it getting worse, what all of those contributing factors are, so basically like why that standard is not being achieved, and then we make our determination document. And then in terms of, you know, the grazing program, then we're legally required, if livestock are a causal factor, then we need to change the livestock management. Now, currently, the range program is the only one that has the regulatory mandate to take action if, you know, if current livestock use is contributing to non-attainment of standards. As you all know, there's a variety of other things, you know. Yeah?
You know what, we got an idea that this, apparently part of the roof blew off, and that's why, and it's on the freeway, that's why they were doing this construction.
Ooh.
They gotta do it, but there is another room that's quieter.
Yeah. Okay.
So we could take a break and be in there for the presentation for you. What everybody think?
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, I can hear you back there, but you're a little
Okay.
It's super distracting. And I think what she has to say is worth our time and attention, and that when
Thanks,
people
Jill.
just get distracted.
Take 10, we'll
Okay.
move this right now on the end.
Sure. Yeah. Talking about like the biotic debris, so leafy matter or whatever that then is able to.
Good, Rita?
Okay. Well,
Could you just start over? I didn't hear very much of the presentation.
Do we need to go back?
so do people really want me to start over? I'm on slide 9 of 21. So, okay. Whew, thank you. Okay. In fact, I decided just to move forward a couple slides. So that, no. But so again, basically, this is the sequence of events for how the standards and guidelines are used in the permit renewal process. So go ahead. And then sage grouse fit into that as well. Go ahead. Okay. And go ahead. Okay, so this is super duper busy, but what I wanted to do was to make sure that everyone understood how we were, because that slide many slides ago said meeting the ecosystems as well as the programs. And so as everyone knows, we have a variety of ecosystems throughout Nevada. And then we're actually pretty far ahead of other states in terms of not only having our ecological site descriptions either finalized or pretty close to being finalized for most of the BLM landmass in Nevada, but we also have state and transition models which show for any ecological site basic states that ecological site can support and how you might move to a degraded or hopefully a better state within, within that same potential of that site. And so we do have the foundation, I believe, to, to use these fairly broad standards for as appropriate for a variety of ecological sites and conditions that those sites are in, due to the fact that we have the ecological site descriptions and the state and transition models for the majority of Nevada. So we have, like I said, 3 sets of standards and guidelines throughout Nevada. In the Mojave Southern Great Basin, we have 3 standards and 21 guidelines. And so within those 3 standards, they were able to include all of the 4 fundamentals of rangeland health. For the Sierra Front Northwest Great Basin, they have 5 standards and 23 guidelines. And for the Northeast Great Basin, they have 4 standards and 14 guidelines. And like I said, I did bring a copy of that. I don't know if like it gets put into, if you guys have like a rack SharePoint or something.
Kathryn, I'm sorry, maybe you're not taking questions as you go, because I missed the first part. But
I noticed, Willie. Go ahead.
the only reason you noticed because I didn't say anything. Why the difference in the number of standards and guidelines, complexity of the basic rangeland situation, or something else?
Well, some combined and some split. So, like for Sierra Front, they have a standard just for wildlife habitat, and then they have a standard for special status species habitat. So they split. Whereas with the Mojave Southern Great Basin, they have like these really all-encompassing kind of standards. And then it's also different in terms of, with the Northeast Great Basin, they just have 14 guidelines. The Sierra Front has guidelines for each standard, like subdivided or whatever. So they just all approached it differently according to what they felt would, best meet the needs of that region. So.
Follow up on that is, does this include, because some of them have separate wild horse and burro.
Right.
This
is only the 1997 ones, because those are like, since I have told you here in this room now, the others should not be used for anything other than perhaps formulating, new revisions or whatever. But those were never approved by the Secretary of Interior, and so they are not official final documents. So, yes. So, okay.
What do those boundaries look like?
I mean, basically like you have the state and it's kind of split into, so down the middle, and Doug probably knows the exact township and range that it's split on, but it's down the middle of the state, and then, the southern half of the state, so like the Caliente office falls into, and Tonopah falls into the Mojave and Mojave, Southern Nevada area, but the entirety of the Sierra Front Field Office, or the entirety of the Carson District, and a large portion of the Winnemucca District, if not all of the Winnemucca District, falls into the Sierra Front guidelines, and then Elko District. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, there is a map in your SOP that shows the eco-regions for the RAGs.
Oh, he was just testing me. Okay. So this is a good example, Willie, of what I just said to you. So this is standard 4 for Sierra Front Great Basin. And then the next slide is actually standard 5. And so they're really the exact same things, except this one's special status species, and number 4 is just, plant and animal habitat. But they're very, very general in scope. So populations and communities of native plant species and habitats for native animal species are healthy, productive, and diverse, as indicated by a good representation of life forms and number of species, good diversity of height, size, and distribution of plants, number of wood stocks, seed stocks, and seed production adequate for stand maintenance, and vegetative mosaic, vegetative corridors for wildlife, and minimal habitat fragmentation. And so these are remember that one of the goals of the standards and guidelines was to create a consistent approach to evaluating, habitat health or land health. And so it gives that consistent definition, but it's still, very general and requires site-specific information in terms of, what can this area create for life forms and numbers of species? Like, is this appropriate for this area or not? And that will vary depending on, what ecological site you're in. And so the same for the special status species habitat. So one thing I do want to point out, go back, one more, is this native plant species. And so as you guys are going through thought processes, one thing that can be very conversation-provoking, type event in the field is when you come across a seeded area that was seeded a while back maybe and has a native and a seeded component. In Idaho, they have like 7 standards, I believe, and one is a seeded standard. Do we have enough, introduced areas on the landscape that there would be a need to evaluate those areas differently? Maybe, maybe not. But those might be thoughts you'd want to entertain. And then the guidelines, there we go. So this is, again, out of the Sierra Front Northwestern Great Basin RAC. And so this is just an example of kind of their subsets of guidelines. And so again, remember the guidelines are written in a way where if these are followed, it would be expected that standards would be met or attained. However, the guidelines are not set in stone. If you find another way to meet a standard, then that is appropriate to do as long as you are meeting or moving towards that standard. But these are just general ecological process-based kind of concepts that would expect the user to be able to meet standards. And so things that would allow seed production, things that would allow species propagation,
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
When you say excluded further livestock grazing, I don't know that I understand it. So we don't want you to graze here anymore, but we'll let you go over there, or how does that work with the farmer?
Well, and so So you'd have to read 7. So appropriate livestock grazing treatments will be implemented to control frequency, duration, and level of grazing use. Where livestock grazing is authorized, grazing systems will provide with any one grazing year one or more of the following treatments. And so they're saying, well, maybe you want to do some type of deferment. Maybe you want to do some systematic rotation. Maybe you want to do continuous season-long grazing if you're meeting these, you know, so it gives you options, and then it says, or maybe you don't want to have livestock there right now if you're not, you know, if that's not going to contribute to a
But do you have an option then to say, maybe that would be the best, and then you guys send them somewhere else? Or do they only get that permit for that one area and they better choose A, B, or C?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a guarantee that another place would be available.
Okay.
So.
That'd be the answer.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, so again, Nevada RACs were originally formed in '95 to help develop these standards and guidelines. And I did want to bring it to the group's attention that the development and amendment of the standards and guides falls under the grazing regulations, 43 CFR 4180 parts 1 and 2, not the RAC regulations. And so Chris and I have been brainstorming on how to get you guys all the information that you might need if we are to go through this process again. I know many of you put effort into some of the previous revisions, and so if that is the desired course of action, we want to make sure that it goes all the way through to finalization this time. So again, please do understand that the 97 RAC standards and guidelines are the only ones that are official. They're the only ones that the Secretary of Interior approved, and so they are the only ones that should be used.
Kathryn?
Yes.
On those, everything that's been submitted since '97, is that literally still in the queue, or is that out the window as far as the Secretary is concerned?
Well, I mean, we never brought it to the Secretary.
It was never brought?
So, no. So the... No, that's fine. Yeah, so that would be, well, we'll get to that a little further, but that may be something that the group would like to entertain bringing it forward further, or further revising it prior to bringing it forward further, or not. Well, best I can tell, not being here at that time, I think it was just a misunderstanding in the state of what was needed to do a revision. And so at that time, it appeared that the state director was believed to have the authority to approve the revision. So.
I think that was the answer.
Okay.
Your previous slide said the, yeah, that one in '95, that the RACs were originally formed
Yes.
to develop standards and guidelines. I assume that's not in statute or anything, that was BLM policy, and where I'm going with this is, if you internally in BLM wanted to update or review the standards and guidelines, you could do it. I doubt that you, since the RACs were involved, and you still have RACs, I doubt you'd do that. But you could do that and submit it yourself to the Secretary.
We would do it in conjunction with the RACs. Whoever, it's the state director that has to initiate revision of the standards and guidelines. And so the RAC would not initiate that revision. The RAC would, and we'll get to this, but I can just jump through them quick when we do. But the RAC would come to the state director with rationale on why they felt revision was needed, and then the state director would agree and initiate said revision, or say, you know, I don't feel that it is needed. So it would still be the state director initiating it.
How come there's not a federal guidelines, standards and guidelines? Because I know there's some allotments that go across state boundaries, and then you have like the Pueblo line that goes on.
Right. So I mean.
And I know people, range cons, that come from one state and they get here and they go, what's going on, you know? And
yeah.
How we do it in Utah or Wyoming. And so why can't we just come up with one, we're a federal agency, not a state-by-state agency. Sometimes we act, well, I keep forgetting I'm retired. I talk like I'm still in the, but why why does the BLM act in some cases like it's a state agency as far as its standards and guidelines and whatnot?
So again, remember, we do have the fundamentals for rangeland health, which would be sort of what you're talking about in terms of the national requirements. And so those transcend the state boundaries or the Resource Advisory Council areas. You know, those are the national standards and guidelines, for lack of a better term, and those were the fallback standards for everyone prior to, you know, the RACs and in geographic areas creating, again, with the basis of those fundamentals, then creating standards and guidelines that better met all of the nuanced needs of that particular geographic area. But the fundamentals, I think, do have what you're asking for in terms of just the nationally consistent base language.
Okay, I kind of remember now. Thanks.
Sure.
Because I need a memory job or 5.
Okay. So Chapter 2 of the manual, which I have provided a copy of here, says that amending standards, state or regionally developed standards may be amended if and when they are found to be inadequately defined to determine conformance with the 4 fundamentals. New and revised or amended standards need to be approved by the Secretary before being implemented. And so this would be what the group would basically be doing should there need to be a revision. You would be looking at why the current standards are inadequate to define or determine conformance with the 4 fundamentals. So be it related to the complexity of ecosystems, be it related to the variety of programs, be it related to whatever, we have clear definition on kind of what would spur a revision, and it's not just like wanting different language, it's having an inadequacy that's demonstrable in what we currently have. Okay, so put the most important slide with the tiniest words. Okay, so this would be sort of the process, and Chris and I will work together to make sure that the RACs have, you know, the process clearly outlined with whatever supporting, you know, documentation is needed. So the RAC would form subcommittees and study whether or not the 1997 Secretary-approved standards and guidelines need to be amended or not. And again, there's kind of clear definition of when an amendment would or wouldn't be needed. And the subcommittee conducts research to answer the questions regarding development and amendment of the standards and guidelines, and those questions are found in the Handbook 4181, and I brought that also, and other appropriate regulations. And so then through that process, if it's determined as a result of this research that the standards and guidelines do need to be modified or amended, then the RAC, I'm not sure how it would work. Chris could probably speak better to how the RACs work together, but I assume like the parent RAC, the tri-RAC, or you know, however it works.
I think you've laid it out pretty well there. The subcommittee would make a recommendation to the parent RAC, who would then decide whether to make a recommendation to the state director.
Right, and so that recommendation would include and be based on that scientific research and that demonstrated deficiency and need. And so then, yeah, that recommendation would then be sent to the state director, and he would review that research and review the recommendation and decide whether to actually initiate the revision or not. So again, it is the state director that initiates the revision, but not by himself. So in closing, 3 sets of RAC standards and guidelines. 97 ones are the only official version, and each set has addressed all of the fundamentals of rangeland health, and this was something that was, you know, decided and approved by the Secretary of Interior at the time. And so if they do not anymore, then we need to demonstrate that. And the standards can be revised, but it is a very large and official process. And by all means, should that be the desired course of action, we want to make sure that any work put into that, culminates in a final result this time. So, questions?
If you have a range con goes out to evaluate grazing allotment, I assume they apply these in their evaluation.
The standards? Yes. Yeah.
That should be the driving thing, I guess.
Yeah, and so that's, all of the data that is collected goes to inform the standards for rangeland health. And so then, they are the basis for alternative development in a permit renewal. They are a large driving force in the creation of your objectives in that area, because you're looking at not only what you have, but what you had. So how are you trending? What are, reasonable objectives that are attainable? And so.
Well, what I was driving at is they're fairly important, but are they being implemented on the ground? And I would assume, maybe wrongfully so, that they could be used by various interests to challenge the BLM. Western watersheds might sue you if you're not meeting them. The cattlemen's might, because they're too restricted. I don't know if that's ever happened. Has it?
Well, and so the standards assessment and evaluation itself is not a protestable or appealable document, but everything that comes out of it really is. So it's your, like I said, it's your framework for then developing your alternatives, for your NEPA analysis, that then you're going to come to a decision on what your next term permit is going to, what the terms and conditions will be. And so that decision is protestable and appealable, but the rangeland health assessment itself isn't. Did that help? Yes, Ken?
Do you foresee having to revise or to revisit these standards and guides just from the standpoint of the sage-grouse? We seem to be in now more of a single species management versus diversity in number of species that are in the current standards. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't personally think that sage-grouse would be the sole driver for any revision that would be needed, because as you saw from the standards, they're broad in general. They're supposed to be including, for plant and animal habitat. It's like, do you have a variety of plants that are reproducing? Do you have, it's very general to meet the needs of all of the species present in that area. We now have some more strictly defined habitat needs for sage-grouse specifically, but they still fit within that larger context of plant and animal habitat needs, So we don't have anything that defined for many of the other species, but there will still be, pronghorn habitat is not as well defined as all of the seasonal sage-grouse habitats, but it still is defined in terms of what they need on the landscape in order to, provide for their life cycle needs. So, so I don't think that sage-grouse themselves would be the driver for a change, but one thing that did come out of the sage-grouse plan amendment, which we're still currently implementing, but is that although livestock, the range program is the only one that has a regulatory response to not meeting standards, but the sage-grouse plan was very specific about the other contributing programs. If it's found that we're not meeting rangeland health standards because of all that OHV use in this big meadow system or whatever, horses come up quite frequently in this context, as you might imagine. But the sage-grouse plan amendment spoke to us taking responsive actions to those other things that are contributing to non-attainment, but still grazing is the only one that has it written in our regulations. What,
But-
you know,
but like table 2.2 takes the standards and guides to a whole new level. I mean, it's way more specific than that. And I know that's in the stage of flux and will maybe be adjusted.
right, but table 2.2 doesn't change standards at all. Like I said, it's a
No,
sub
but-
thing.
But if you implement 2.2 on the ground, what it does is it takes that standard that's very general and it makes it very specific.
Right, right, for a specific species, yeah. Yeah.
That may be what Ken's worried.
Well, it's always been a concern of mine, you know, like the immediate, you know, I used to, and it should still be about diversity. And I just hate when we get into single species, whether it be sage-grouse or anything, there should be a degree of diversity out there, and I just hate to see this disproportionate to.
Right, and
To clearly, I guess, maybe answer Willie's question is the table 2.2 and those standards that are identified there, those guidelines that are identified there, they are specific to sage-grouse. And so they inform the look at the standards and guides overall. And that's what they do, is they provide one viewpoint, one fact that goes into it. And so if you wrongly look at that and say your decision is based upon that, then you've not collected the data correctly and you've not done your analysis correctly, because the standards and guides are much broader than that.
Right.
And they have to factor in 15 or 20 criteria versus one.
Right.
So I think that's where people get lost with table 2.2 and that whole discussion.
right. Yeah, is where it fits in the totem pole or whatever, but. So it's one of, if you think back on the sequence of events that I had, how standards work within the permit renewal context, you know, I had added, yeah, it's like, so here, we have prioritize assessment areas, gather information, assess and evaluate, and then are you meeting or not, but this gather information for assessment, I mean, it's all the way back here that sage-grouse now with the, go forward with it. So the habitat suitability is like one piece of information that we're including for sage-grouse along with all of the other data that we're collecting on that landscape. And then when we're looking at the actual standards attainment, we're looking at all of that holistically together, not like just did we meet table 2.2. So. It's so quiet in here.
You want that noise back?
Yeah, exactly. Okay,
We're all meditating on your profound presentation.
I have that effect.
Yeah. Well, I guess kind of a reminder, like, we had this presentation, or very similar to it, with the Sierra Front Rack. And the discussion that followed up with that presentation was kind of, are there any issues with the current set of standards that are creating problems? I mean, is there a situation where your interdisciplinary team is in the field and one specialist is interpreting it one way and one another way, and you reach a loggerhead where you
Right.
can't get past it? And I think, and then the other part of that question is, and is the solution to that, if that's happening, a revision of the standards and guides, or is it simply, and I think Ralph was the one that said, hey, this, you don't want to close in your room for decision-making by being overly prescriptive in these standards and guidelines. And so it boiled down to, is there a problem that needs to be addressed? And I think that we kind of walked away as the Sierra Front Rack going, it doesn't appear that there's a problem that's so significant that it's worth the time and energy to open this process back up and try to make a change. And that's kind of where we landed as the one RAC, but there was still a need to engage the other two RACs that
Right.
were participating in the subgroup. In that
Was that depending on where the need lies, there may be the ability to add some consistent approach or interpretation without getting all the way back to standard revision, you know? And so like you're saying, do we actually have a deficiency in the standards themselves, or do we, you know, just need some clear understanding throughout the state on how seeded species fit within this interpretation, or how to correctly document, you know, all of your, contributing components to non-attainment, or how, like, so there may be some other approaches that would help add clarity throughout the state that might not have to go all the way back to a standard revision. But
well, and to be frank, I think if we'd have had a subgroup meeting, which we haven't since the last TRIRAC meeting, we may have tabled this as a topic and moved on to something that our investment in time and energy might have a better payoff. I think that that's where the subgroup may have been heading, but again, we haven't really gotten that far in our discussion process to say that with certainty.
right. And so I do think, Ken, I think that probably the whole table 2.2 discussion, because that's been a big topic for a couple years now, you know, I think that probably, at least partially, you know, made people think that this might be something that was needed. But, yeah, I'm not sure sage grouse themselves would be the driver, and we do have a new IM from Washington office as of December defining what Table 2.2, you know, can and can't be used for, you know. So that has helped give some clarity as well. And
you know, one of the things too that a revision could do now versus addressing any possible deficiency is we have things that John talked about this morning, like outcome-based grazing and targeted grazing to reduce fuels that could easily be amended into the guidelines. And so there's things that we can, I mean, these are old, and all three of the RAC standards mirror the fallback standards that Kathryn was talking about. So it's not like they're dramatically different. So I also see an opportunity of maybe having one set of standards and guidelines for the state and not having three different ones. It's something to consider going forward.
right. And there's another sort of, I'll just throw this out, although you guys don't have to do anything with it, but we also have nationally the RIME report, which is the Rangeland Inventory Monitoring and Evaluation Report, and that's something that we nationally feed data into on an annual basis for public dissemination, and it's a very broad report about you know, how many acres fit into each of the fundamental categories, as well as it still has an old like inventory component. But so that's our opportunity to depict nationally, you know, acreages of land that we're improving through the years, conversely acreages that may not be improving, but yeah, but it does get a little, especially like with Southern Nevada, because they clumped everything, and so sometimes it's a little hard to split their stuff out into the different rhyme fundamental sections. But that would not be a reason to revise the standards.
Can you do that somewhat like Table 2 does and just add supplemental detail to make that?
Yes, yeah, and that's what we're actually working on, is getting templates for the different RAC areas for the offices to use when they're developing their standards assessment and evaluation, so that they can speak to all of the national database stuff at the same time that they're, you know, dealing with their local assessment. So.